In 2024, I managed to produce 53 videos for this channel. Some of the stories we looked at sparked a lot of interest in the comment section. Some brought people a lot of joy, others made people cry, and some ignited outrage. In this video, we're going to take a look back at the most interesting all-about-nature stories from the past year. The Yangtze giant softshell turtle is one of the largest freshwater turtles in the world. It's known to live in the Yangtze River and Lake Tai in central China, as well as a small region of southern China and northern Vietnam. They've been hunted for centuries for their meat and for their shells, leading to them becoming extremely rare by the 21st century. It's one of the most secretive species of turtle, mostly staying deep underwater and rarely surfacing to breathe. This has made it really difficult to know how many wild specimens actually still exist in the world. In the early 2000s, only one female was known to still exist. She was transferred from the zoo where she was being kept to another zoo which had a male specimen. Over the coming years, she would lay multiple batches of eggs, including one after being artificially inseminated, but none of the eggs ever hatched. It's believed that a poor diet at the zoo led to the inviability of all of her eggs. Sadly, in 2019, she died. In 2012, evidence of wild turtles surfaced in Vietnam. 6 years later, in 2018, scientists finally managed to confirm that 2 more turtles were in fact surviving in Xuan Can Lake, and genetic testing done in 2020 confirmed that one of them was a female. Unfortunately, in 2023, the female was found to have died of unknown causes, and it's unknown if she ever successfully laid any fertile eggs. There have been other reported sightings, but extensive surveys have failed to find any other living turtles. Today, only the captive male in China and the wild male in Vietnam are known to still be alive. The bald eagle is one of only 2 species of eagle found in the United States and Canada. With its beautiful white head and tail and impressive wingspan of up to 2.3 meters, or 7.5 feet, it's been the national symbol of the United States since 1782. But there was a time when this majestic bird was almost wiped out. In the 18th century, it's estimated that as many as 500,000 bald eagles called the lower 48 states of the USA home. But the human population in the US was booming, and settlements were expanding. Throughout the 19th century, much of the eastern United States was deforested to convert land for farming and urban development. This had a devastating effect on the bald eagle population. The species relies on large trees to build their nests, but with no more large trees to be found, they disappeared from much of the country. At the same time, farmers were worried about the presence of the eagles. They didn't want to lose their livestock to them, and even feared that the bald eagles were capable of carrying away their small children. They began to shoot the birds whenever they got a chance, and this continued for over a century. In 1918, the bald eagle became a protected species in the United States and Canada, and in 1940, it received full protection from hunting and trapping. While the ban should have allowed the species to recover, the greatest threat was just about to start. During World War II, insect-borne diseases were threatening troops stationed in tropical regions. In 1939, Swiss scientist Paul Hermann Müller discovered that a compound known as DDT was an extremely effective insecticide. The US Army began to use it in an effort to protect the troops from mosquito-borne diseases. After the war, it became commercially available and began to be widely used in the US, promoted as a safe way to protect crops. In fact, some states even sprayed people with it in public spaces in a misguided effort to eradicate polio. But DDT had another devastating side effect. As it ran into the groundwater, it accumulated in streams, rivers, and lakes, where it contaminated fish stocks. These fish were then consumed by bald eagles, and the DDT began to build up in their systems. The insecticide interfered with their ability to metabolize calcium. This caused the eagles to either become sterile or to lay eggs that had extremely thin and weak shells. Just a slight bump would break the egg. With almost no chicks hatching, the species fell into a rapid decline. Within only about 5 years of DDT being used commercially, the bald eagle population in the lower 48 was down to fewer than 1,000 mature birds. But no one could figure out why. In 1967, the bald eagle was declared endangered. But the mystery of its decline was also finally solved that same year. Members of environmental groups had noticed that bird populations were heavily declining in areas where the commercial use of DDT was taking place. The Environmental Defense Fund began to pressure governments to ban DDT, and in 1972, they succeeded. A near total ban on the use of DDT came into effect, and eagle populations began to rebound. In the 80s and 90s, the bald eagle population was up to just over 100,000 birds. By the early 2000s, scientists stopped counting them because they had become so plentiful. In 1999, the bald eagle was moved from being an endangered species to being assessed as least concern, the lowest possible rating a species can get. There are now estimated to be over 300,000 bald eagles in the lower 48 states, as many as 500,000 in Canada, and about 70,000 in the state of Alaska alone. Australia has quite a few species of marsupial that are known and loved the world over, one of which is the wombat. But what many don't know is that wombats are not just one species of marsupial, rather 3. The common wombat, the southern hairy-nosed wombat, and the northern hairy-nosed wombat. Of the 3, by far the rarest is the northern hairy-nosed wombat, which is listed as critically endangered. 100 years ago, the species could be found across New South Wales, Victoria, and Queensland. But as the population of Australia grew in the early 20th century, much of the species range was converted for agricultural use. The wombats didn't just lose their habitat, but they were also regularly culled in order to protect farmers' crops. By the time the culling had stopped, wild dogs had become numerous and regularly preyed on the northern hairy-nosed wombats. By the 21st century, the species had become restricted to an area of about 300 hectares in the Epping National Forest in Queensland, and their population was only at about 100 animals. But wild dogs were still regularly killing them. Park officials set up a predator-proof fence in an effort to protect the species, but having all of the animals in only one spot was a huge risk. One major disease or natural disaster was all it would take to wipe them out. So a secondary population was established in Richard Underwood Nature Refuge in 2008. Conservation efforts have been extensive. Volunteers monitor the fences and the area surrounding the parks. Invasive species like African bufflegrass are being removed to allow the wombats easier access to the native species that they prefer. And genetic research is being done to combat gender disparity in the population, as more than 2/3 of the wombats are male, and scientists still don't know why. The Galapagos Islands are some of the most visited and researched islands in the world. For centuries, they were visited by sailors who were looking for an easy meal. The islands are home to a huge variety of endemic species, and when Charles Darwin visited in 1835, their fame would spread around the world. Darwin observed something interesting. The islands were dominated by only a few groups of animals, mostly birds and reptiles. But despite only a few biological groups being present, they showed a remarkable variety of physical shape and ecological role. This played a major part in his development of the theory of natural selection. Over the past 2 centuries, the islands have been at the center of the study of evolutionary biology. So much so that today there are over 100 scientists performing research on the islands at any given time. This is especially remarkable considering the fact that the Galapagos Islands are only about the same size as North Yorkshire. But it isn't just scientists flocking to the islands. Tourists also love to visit, with as many as 270,000 of them stopping by each year. And the main attraction is still the amazing wildlife. The Galapagos is home to over 600 native species of plant, 450 species of marine fish, 140 species of bird, and 25 species of reptile. While the most famous reptiles on the islands are the giant tortoises, the most commonly seen are the iguanas. In 1825, the first species was scientifically described, the marine iguana. They're the smallest species of iguana on the islands, and they range in color from black to red. This abundant species is frequently encountered on the beaches and rocky shorelines, being the only marine species of lizard in the world. 6 years later, in 1831, the second species was described. The Galapagos land iguana is considerably larger than the marine iguanas. They live on 6 of the islands and range in color from yellow to orange to gray. For about 70 years, only these 2 species were known about, until in 1903, a third species was described. The Santa Fe land iguana only lives on Santa Fe Island. While it looks quite similar to the Galapagos land iguana, the species is a pale tan color and has a more tapered snout. The number of iguana species stood at 3, and it would remain so for over a century. But the Galapagos were yet to reveal their biggest surprise. Despite all the researchers and tourists that were visiting and exploring the islands, one species of iguana had managed to go undetected. In 1986, on the slopes of Wolf Volcano, the 4th species of Galapagos iguana was seen for the first time, while some park rangers were exploring the area. They were at a high elevation and in an area that was quite difficult to reach, when they stumbled on an iguana that they didn't recognize. While it had a similar body shape to the Galapagos land iguanas, there was one key difference. They were pink. The rangers told local researchers what they saw. Some thought they must be a new species, while others assumed that they might just be a subspecies or color variation of the Galapagos land iguana. No one would really go looking for them for another 14 years. In 2000, a thorough study of these pink iguanas began, and scientists noticed some key differences. Physiologically, they clearly had a distinct color, but closer examination showed that they also have differences on the crests on the back of their necks. They also showed behavioral differences. Iguanas nod their heads to show annoyance or to warn others to stay out of their territory. But the pink iguanas showed a more complex form of head nodding than other species of iguana on the islands. Finally, they also have a distinct range. While the Galapagos land iguana is regularly found at low elevations, the pink land iguana can only be found above 600 meters and can live all the way up to the summit of Wolf Volcano at 1,700 meters. In 2009, over a century since the last species of Galapagos iguana was described, the pink land iguana was finally scientifically named, and the IUCN assessed it as critically endangered. They can only survive on the slopes of Wolf Volcano above 600 meters, and this limits their total range to only 25 square kilometers. Within that range, they're actually quite rare, and their population stands at only about 200 mature lizards. This helps explain how the species managed to evade detection in one of the most biologically studied places on Earth. Thankfully, a lot of work is being done on the islands to protect native species, and researchers hope to establish a captive breeding program to ensure that the pink land iguanas are not lost. Bananas are a common fruit, but what many don't realize is that there are about 1,000 varieties of banana and 68 recognized species. The majority of the edible varieties are derived from only 2 wild species from South and Southeast Asia, Musa acuminata and Musa balbisiana. In the tropical northeastern corner of Australia, 2 native species of banana can be found, but the region used to have a 3rd species of wild banana that has only ever been recorded once. In 1849, an Irish-born botanist named Eugene Fitzalan arrived in Australia. He had a passion for orchids, and his hope was to explore the tropical forests of Queensland in order to discover some new species. He teamed up with Ferdinand von Mueller, and together they described many new species of plant. On an expedition through the forests around Daintree River, Fitzalan came across a banana plant that he didn't recognize. He collected several different parts of the plant, including the leaves and the fruit. In 1875, von Mueller examined the specimen and determined that it was new to science. He gave it the epithet Musa fitzalanii in honor of Eugene Fitzalan, who collected it, and today it has the common name of Daintree river banana. But this was the one and only time that the species has ever been seen. Several expeditions for the plant failed to rediscover it, including a banana collecting expedition to the area in 1956. Because of this, the species is considered to have gone extinct. In 2019, a journal article detailing research on the 71 recently extinct species of plant in Australia found that 9 of these extinct species are only known from the type specimen, including Daintree river banana. As a result, they concluded that these species should be considered taxonomically suspect, as not enough evidence of their existence exists to be studied today. Also, the age of the specimen, combined with the fact that only fragments of the plant were collected, make it even harder to know for sure that Daintree river banana was in fact a unique species. Perhaps one of my favorite stories of the discovery of a species is that of the Wollemi pine, which I actually covered in one of my earliest videos already. On September 10th, 1994, David Noble, a new South Wales National Park field officer, decided to go on one of his many hikes in the Wollemi National Park, which is about 150 kilometers outside of Sydney. On this day, as he came to some narrow, steep-sided sandstone gorges, David made one of the biggest botanical discoveries of the century. Being a park ranger, he had quite a bit of knowledge of plants in the area, so he was surprised that this valley housed one that he had never seen before. And it wasn't just a small, solitary plant. David encountered a grove of just under 100 massive trees, some as much as a meter in diameter, reaching heights of 40 meters. Noticing the strange features of the trees, David made the decision to take some cuttings back to a colleague at the national park. 6 months later, the tree was identified. And as it turned out, the trees were very well known to scientists, though no one had ever seen one in person before. In fact, this entire genus was thought to have died out millions of years ago. There are fossils of Wollemi pines as old as 200 million years. The species was believed to have been common in eastern Australia until about 40 million years ago, when it started to die out.
The trees were viewed as part of the distant past, food for ancient herbivorous dinosaurs. No one suspected that they were still holding on, unchanged, in a tiny gorge near Sydney, Australia. The location of the trees was made top secret and remains so today. Fear of outsiders visiting the gorge and introducing new diseases has made this necessary to protect the trees. Thankfully, it turns out that the Wollemi pine is easy to grow and clone. They tolerate a huge range of temperatures from as high as 45 degrees Celsius down to as low as -12, and are easily grown in pots, both in and outdoors. Thousands have since been cultivated for private collections and public gardens. In fact, when I was recently in Melbourne, I visited the Royal Botanic Gardens, Victoria, and made a point to find the Wollemi pine that they had in their collection. And I'm pretty sure that people thought I was crazy as I took about 1,000,000 pictures of it. There are only about 100 wild trees still surviving, and of course, they're listed as being critically endangered and are threatened by wildfires and a virulent water mold that has already been detected in the trees and was probably introduced by unauthorized visitors to the site.
In 1955, a group of 17 killer whales washed ashore near Paraparaumu, New Zealand. People were amazed to see the whales up on the beach, and thankfully, someone snapped a few pictures of them. But when marine biologists laid eyes on the photos, one thing was clear. These were not normal orcas. Orcas are some of the most easily identifiable toothed whale species in the world. The high dorsal fins of the males and their distinctive black and white coloration make them iconic ocean animals. They also have a preference for coastal waters, meaning that humans come in contact with them far more than some pelagic species. So it was surprising that the orcas in the photographs hadn't been documented before. There were several marked differences. For one, the large white spot behind the eye was a fraction of the size it normally would be. They also had no marking behind the dorsal fin like other southern orcas. Finally, their heads were far more rounded and bulbous than any known type of orca. This would have simply been dismissed as an abnormality if it weren't for the fact that all 17 of them had the same features. Researchers realized that this was probably a group of orcas that was new to science. The taxonomy of orcas is extremely complex and under constant dispute. They live in tight-knit groups and develop distinct cultures and diets. Some only eat fish, while others will beach themselves hunting seals on land. Recently in the news, a group of orcas near Gibraltar began a new behavior. They were ramming into boats with their heads, and in some cases sinking them. Researchers still aren't sure why they were doing this, but it's believed that the younger teenage orcas were teaching each other, and that it was actually a sort of teen fad in the local orca culture. It's because of the differences that they have in culture that the different types of orca rarely, if ever, interbreed. In the North Pacific, orca populations are divided into 3 types of whales, based on culture. There are the residents, the transients, and the offshore orcas. In the North Atlantic, there are Type 1 orcas that eat schooling fish, and Type 2 that eat baleen whales. But the waters of the Southern Ocean around Antarctica have some of the greatest diversity of orcas. Today, they're divided into 5 types: A, B1, B2, C, and D, and it has taken a long time to understand which is which, with the debate being ongoing. The beached orcas were certainly a distinct type, but where they lived or how they escaped detection was far from known, and they wouldn't be recorded again for half a century. In 2005, some American orca researchers were at a killer whale workshop in Seattle, Washington, when a French researcher shared a story about a problem from the southern Indian Ocean. A group of orcas were pestering fishing vessels, stealing their catch before they could get them on board. It was happening near the Crozet Islands, and the strangest thing about the story was that the orcas that were doing it were rather odd-looking. The American researchers, who had seen the photos of the stranding in New Zealand from 50 years before, recalled the unique features of those whales, and they suspected that the orcas in the southern Indian Ocean were the same type. They pored over decades of orca photos from the Southern Ocean, and were surprised to find that the odd-looking orcas had been photographed on several occasions. They published a paper proposing the existence of the Type D killer whale, and the evidence continued to pour in. The first video of wild Type D orcas was recorded in 2014 near the Crozet Islands. In 2017, they were filmed again off of Cape Horn, Chile. Researchers wanted to get a skin biopsy sample to see if they were the same as the orcas that had been stranded in New Zealand in 1955. 2 of the skulls of whales from the first beaching had been preserved, and the DNA had already been sequenced. In January 2019, a team set off from Cape Horn, Chile, to a spot that fishermen had said they had regularly seen the odd-looking orcas. They sailed to lower altitudes, between 40 and 50 degrees, and the seas were horrible. High winds and crazy waves kept them from spending much time seeing any wildlife. But one day, as the seas calmed and they came to the spot the fishermen said that they regularly saw the orcas, there they were. They needed to get close, but they weren't sure how the pod would respond. But as the boat got to within 50 meters of the whales, they turned towards the boat and began to circle them. They spent 3.5 hours with the pod, recording their vocalizations, observing their behavior, and most importantly, collecting skin biopsies. The DNA matched, and the identity of the Type D killer whales was solved. The team also solved the mystery of how they avoided detection for so long. This type lives exclusively in a stretch of ocean all the way around Antarctica, just outside of the polar region. These are some of the roughest waters in the world, and are rarely studied because of how dangerous they are. In 2005, a large new species of tree frog was discovered in Panama. Given the common name of Rarest's fringe-limbed tree frog, the species was truly unique. For one, it was a gliding species of frog, able to use its webbed hands and feet to soar from the canopy of trees to safety as it attempted to elude predators. But their breeding behavior was by far the most unique thing about them. The species laid eggs in water-filled tree holes, where the males fiercely guarded their territories from other males. After the eggs were laid and the tadpoles hatched, the males would continue to care for and feed their offspring. It was the only known species of frog where the young survived by eating the skin cells of their fathers. The tree frogs went extinct from a combination of 2 factors. One problem was their incredibly small range. They were only known from a small area of cloud forest on the Pacific-facing slopes of a single mountain range, and it's estimated that their total range covered no more than 100 square kilometers. The other problem was an outbreak of the amphibian chytrid fungus within their range. This fungal infection thickens the skins of amphibians, causing their organs to shut down, and almost always kills any frog that it infests. Scientists knew that the fungus was going to cause problem for the new species, so in 2006, the scientists that discovered these tree frogs made a crucial decision. All of the specimens of Rarest's fringe-limbed tree frog that had been collected to describe the species were sent to facilities in Panama and the United States to safeguard them against extinction. It was just in time, too. The amphibian chytrid fungus outbreak hit and rapidly decimated the only known wild population of the species. The last wild documentation of Rarest's fringe-limbed tree frog was in 2007, when a single male was recorded calling in the mating season. After that, no specimen was ever recorded alive in the wild again, and only the captive population remained. In captivity, the species thrived, but replicating their breeding conditions proved to be too difficult. This is because the researchers hadn't gotten a chance yet to perform an in-depth study of the species' breeding habits before it disappeared. The captive frogs would breed, but the tadpoles would almost immediately die. So one by one, as the captive frogs died, the species inched towards extinction. Their fate was sealed when the last female died in 2009 at the Atlanta Botanical Gardens. By 2012, there were only 2 males left. One of them was suffering from declining health, and the decision was made to euthanize it. The species had its endling. The last of Rabs' fringe-limbed tree frogs survived at Zoo Atlanta and was given the nickname Tuffy. He was kept in a special enclosure called the frog pod, which ensured that he wasn't exposed to any pathogen that would shorten his life. While captive frogs had mated, none of the males had ever been observed performing breeding vocalizations in captivity. That is until December 14th, 2014. For the first time ever since arriving at the zoo, Tuffy began to sing. Of course, there was no way he could know that he was the sole remaining survivor of his species, and no female would ever come. On September 26, 2016, being an estimated 12 years old, Tuffy died at Zoo Atlanta. While we can't yet say for certain that some wild population of Rabs' fringe-limbed tree frog won't be found holding on in an unexplored part of Panama, it seems that the species has been lost forever. The IUCN still lists it as critically endangered, though it's unlikely that they will ever be seen again. On the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands lives a large, beautiful kingfisher that has very rarely been seen. It has an iridescent blue back, tail, and wings, a light orange head and chest, and 2 bright blue stripes on either side of its face. One stripe extends from the beak and is what gives it the common name of Guadalcanal mustached kingfisher. In the 1920s, a female was collected for the first time. Then in the 1950s, more females were collected, but the males evaded researchers. After decades of searching for the elusive bird, a team of researchers found and captured a male in 2015, taking the first ever pictures of a living specimen of this species. Because no males existed in any museum collection, the male pictured was euthanized and added to one. This has been a standard practice for biologists for centuries. But when news of this rare bird being killed surfaced, there was public outcry. So much so that the scientists pictured with the kingfisher needed to make a public statement defending his actions. There remains a strong debate about the ethics of collecting rare animals for scientific purposes. This one is particularly strange. On May 21st, 2022, the Amarillo Zoo in Texas reportedly caught this image on a camera that was monitoring their perimeter fence. The image shows a creature that appears to be walking on 2 legs, has arms hanging at its sides, and a dog-like head with a furry mane. A few weeks later, the city of Amarillo posted the image on Facebook, asking for the public to give their guess about what the creature might be. They referred to it as a UAO, an unidentified Amarillo object. They emphasized that while the creature was walking outside the zoo's perimeter fence, there were no signs of criminal activity, no signs of illegal attempts to enter the facility, and no damage to the property. The guesses from social media users ranged from scientific to otherworldly to hoax. In terms of natural explanations, the main theory was that it was a coyote that happened to be captured just as it stood up on its hind legs. Coyotes and foxes are the only wild dog species known to live in the area, though the Mexican gray wolf also once roamed through Amarillo. Others felt that this animal, like the one that was seen in Maine, could in fact be a chupacabra in search of animals to hunt. But the majority of the people who commented on the post felt that this had to be a person in a costume. Whether this image was accidentally caught by the zoo or whether it was planned by the zoo isn't known. But some felt that the fact that the city of Amarillo was who went public with the photo meant that this was actually a publicity stunt for the city itself. If it was, it worked. But the city and the zoo have both made no further comments about the image that was supposedly captured in 2022. Do you think this was a hoax? Or do you think this is a genuine image of a real animal? Around the time the flamingo was being shot in Canada, a private zoo was being established near Medellin, Colombia. Pablo Escobar was a drug lord who had amassed a huge amount of wealth. He decided that he would bring in animals from around the world to create a private menagerie on his hacienda. Among the exotic animals that were imported were 4 African hippos. They remained on the hacienda for the next 20 years, thriving in the warm tropical climate. Hippos are semi-aquatic herbivores, so they're tied to areas with plenty of water and sufficient grass for them to eat. In Colombia, they found both in abundance. In 1993, Pablo Escobar was killed, and his hacienda was abandoned. Many of the smaller, more docile animals were rounded up and placed in zoos, but the hippos were too dangerous, and no one really knew how to deal with them. As a result, they were left to wander the estate. It didn't take long for them to escape and make their way over to the nearby Magdalena River. Once free, the hippos began to breed, and by 2007, the population was up to 16 animals in the river. Local people didn't fear the hippos, but rather loved having them around. They became a local tourist attraction, and people began to profit off of the hippos in the river. But in 2009, recognizing that something needed to be done about the feral population, the government came in and shot an adult male that the locals had named Pepe. When images of Pepe began to circulate online, there was public outcry, and the government took a step back. By 2014, there were 40 hippos in the river, and they were expanding their range. In 2017, the government decided to try a different method. They captured a male and castrated him in order to slow the breeding process. Unfortunately, the procedure cost the government $50,000, making castration an unviable long-term solution. In 2019, the population had increased to as many as 120 animals spread across a 2,250 square kilometer area. So some studies were performed to determine the specific impact of the hippos. Some scientists had been arguing that the hippos were going to have a positive impact on the local environment, believing that they introduced beneficial nutrients to the water. But these beliefs were based on studies that had been performed in their native range in Africa. In Colombia, the study showed that the hippos were in fact damaging the environment. The water was being infected with cyanobacteria, causing an increase in algae blooms. And to make matters worse, the Magdalena River is home to several threatened and endangered species, including the West Indian manatee, Dall's tow-headed turtle, and the Magdalena River turtle. The hippos were likely having an unknown negative impact on all of these species. So the government began a program in 2021 to sterilize the hippos through vaccines. Again, the public rose up against the government. International animal rights groups filed a lawsuit against the Colombian government to stop them, but this time it didn't work. By 2023, there were over 200 hippos in the wild, and the government announced a 3-part plan to control the hippo population. at least 70 of the animals would be transferred to zoos in Mexico and India. 40 per year would be sterilized, and if necessary, some of the animals would be exterminated. While these measures are clearly not in the best interest of the hippos, the environmental concerns for other species in the Magdalena River were cited as justification for the government's actions. What do you think? Should the hippos be left alone, or is the government right for wanting to put an end to the feral hippo population? In 2002, Mark van Roosmalen, a Dutch primatologist, was performing research in the Rio Araucazinho Basin in the Brazilian state of Amazonas. As part of his research, he regularly consulted with local people to find out what they were encountering in the forests. In September of that year, one of the tribes he was consulting with had something strange in their possession. It was a complete skull of a recently killed male manatee. That, in and of itself, wasn't strange, as the Amazonian manatee was known from the region, and the local people hunted and consumed them on occasion. What was strange was its size. The skull was nearly 3 times smaller than the skull of the Amazonian manatee, but there was a simple explanation. This may have simply been a juvenile Amazonian manatee. But van Roosmalen wasn't convinced. The molar teeth on the skull were worn down, much like the molars of an adult manatee would be, and far more than the molars on any juvenile should have been. Van Roosmalen was convinced that there was more to this skull, but he wouldn't find any more evidence of a new manatee species until 2 years later. In 2004, van Roosmalen was visiting one of the tribes he had regular contact with, when one of the men surprised him with something. He had captured an adult male manatee 7 kilometers from the confluence with the Aripuanã River, and it was still alive. When van Roosmalen saw it, he was confident that this was the same type of manatee as the one he had a skull for. It differed from the Amazonian manatee in several ways. For starters, it lived in a very different environment from the Amazonian manatees. While Amazonian manatees prefer deep, slow-moving white or black water, these small manatees seem to prefer faster-moving, clear water streams that were quite shallow. As a result of having much more sun exposure, they had developed much darker skin than Amazonian manatees. When compared to juvenile Amazonian manatees, they also were far less bulky and more streamlined. The animal they had captured weighed 60 kilograms and measured 130 centimeters long, and it had a white patch on its chest. It also had short flippers, which couldn't reach its mouth. This was quite different from Amazonian manatees, whose juveniles have flippers that are able to reach their mouths. When comparing the skulls side by side, the difference is even clearer. On the left is an adult Amazonian manatee skull. On the right is a juvenile Amazonian manatee skull. And in the middle is the skull of the dwarf manatee van Roosmalen had collected. Especially when compared with the juvenile skull, there are clear differences in skull length and the wear on the teeth. Van Roosmalen needed to know definitively whether this was a juvenile or not, so he built an enclosure in a stream and observed it to see whether or not it would grow. In the first 4 months, he didn't observe any growth, and the animal ate vegetation supplied to it without any issues. But around the 4-month mark, it escaped and could no longer be observed. For the next 9 years, the exact location of the wild population eluded van Roosmalen. Then, in 2013, he conducted an expedition by canoe with a colleague, and they found what they believed to be the last existing population of dwarf manatees in the wetlands situated along the northern branch of the upper Rio Araucazinho. They found several manatees there, foraging in shallow streams, and they estimated that the total population was likely no more than 100 animals. They took DNA samples to compare them genetically with Amazonian manatees, and were shocked at what they found. The two were a match. Despite clearly inhabiting different environments and being morphologically different, they seemed to in fact be the same species. But how could this be? Van Rysmalen had some theories. Firstly, he felt that the dwarf manatees likely split from the Amazonian manatees fairly recently, no more than 485,000 years ago. While this split wouldn't be enough time for major genetic changes to occur, it would be enough time for dwarfism to happen. In the late Pleistocene, a group of mammoths got stuck on the Channel Islands, off the coast of California, when the ice melted. Within only about 5,000 years, their body size had reduced by about 65% in response to being stuck in a smaller space. Van Rysmalen hypothesized that some Amazonian manatees once got trapped in shallow, clear water streams, and over a few thousand years, they quickly adapted and shrank in size in order to survive. He also hypothesized that there had been some gene flow between the dwarf manatees and the Amazonian manatees in more recent history, accounting for their similar genotypes. But if the two species could in fact interbreed, would this not mean that they were still the same species? I am not going to get into it in this video, but there is a lot of debate about what constitutes a species. The general accepted definition is a group of individuals that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring under natural conditions. So, while lions and tigers can produce offspring, their offspring are generally sterile. But there are scientifically accepted exceptions to this rule. For example, polar bears and grizzly bears can produce offspring that are in fact fertile. Yet, we accept both species as separate and valid. Van Rysmalen argued that the dwarf manatees had become so isolated ecologically that they essentially didn't have natural opportunities to interbreed with the Amazonian manatees. Coupling this with their extreme morphological differences, he felt that instead of making them a subspecies, they should in fact be described as a fully separate species. He submitted his findings to the scientific journal Nature for peer review, but his conclusions were rejected. Then in 2015, he submitted his findings to Biodiversity Journal, and his paper was finally published. Despite being published, the dwarf manatee is highly disputed. Many scientists believe that the genetic research speaks louder than all of the other data, and that on this alone, the dwarf manatee cannot be accepted as a legitimate species. Others disagree. It remains disputed to this day, and the IUCN doesn't recognize it as legitimate. If it is its own species, time is running out for the dwarf manatees. With their tiny population size and 0 protected areas within their range, it may only be a matter of years before they're all gone. And those are some of the highlights from the past year. I look forward to seeing what stories spark discussion in 2025. Thanks to all of you who have been here and supported the channel over the last year. I want to say a special thanks to my patrons. Without their ongoing support, I wouldn't be able to produce a video like this every week. If you want to support the channel, consider joining us on Patreon. The link is in the video description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.